we can get going. We can get going then. I don't know how many more people will come, but all right. All right. Hello, everyone. Good Tuesday, or I guess not so good of a Tuesday. Does anybody know what's going on in Franklin Hall? Anyone have any more info? I don't have my phone on me, so I didn't see it. Yeah. Okay. So we're just waiting basically until that's done. I see. Okay, well, then we can all breathe a little easier. I suppose. Um, So today we're going to be talking about remote sensing. We've brought up remote sensing a few times in the past, but now we'll really kind of get into it. So first, we're just going to do a quick recap of geospatial data and GIS, which is pretty deeply related with remote sensing, but probably good to just go over it again. Then we'll talk about remote sensing itself. So we'll talk about what it is. We'll go over what platforms are used for it, which I'll talk about what that means soon. We'll talk about its history a bit, because I'm a big fan of historicizing all of these things and making sure we know that they're not just natural and were created by people. Then we'll talk about the Howley et al. Article that you should have read before class. I hope you all read it. And I know it's a little bit different than some of the other papers that we've read because it's more of an academic paper, but I hope that you were able to read it and everything and kind of understand it. Then we'll talk about Indiana map, and in doing so, we'll end the class with a activity on remote sensing. Does anybody have any questions or anything? Maybe about the labs or quizzes or anything that you want to go over before the lecture begins? Yeah, Jesse. Yeah. So on the first answer on the quiz, there's graticule twice. If you answered it correctly and then it marked you as incorrect, I will fix that when it happens. So don't worry about that. Any other questions about that or anything else? How are things going for everyone? Are the labs and activities, are you doing okay with them? They're not feeling overwhelmed or anything or having too much trouble? And if you do, of course, you can get in touch with Joseph or I about that. Okay, well, I'm gonna assume that everyone's all right then. So then we'll continue to remote sensing or a recap first. So what is GIS? And when I say what is GIS, I mean what is GIS as we talk about it today. Some of you must have some idea what GIS is after we spent a week talking about it and you read about it. Yeah. Yeah, so that's part of it, layering data over a map. What's your name again? Margaret. Thank you, Margaret. So that is definitely part of it. Layers are very, very important for GIS. But what is GIS as a whole? Yeah, Luca. Sure. Yep, thank you. So it is a computer system that's used to capture, store, search, analyze, and display geospatial data. And it's one that uses layers very, very deeply, as we can kind of see in this image. And it is classified as an information technology. And so it requires hardware, which would be things like computers, scanners, GPS, drones, the things that are kind of collecting the data, or the computers that are being used to analyze the data. Then you've got your software itself. And so if you remember, we briefly talked about that on Thursday. There is GIS software for basically anything you can think of, but the main big ones are ArcGIS and QGIS. Then we've got people. People are a very important one for this, just in terms of who is collecting the data and who is doing that analysis and everything else. We also need infrastructure, though. And so by infrastructure, we mean things like you need internet connection to be able to share a lot of this information. You need electricity to be able to power all of the analysis that you're doing. You need data depositories where you can store all of your information, and you need like standards of data so that way it can be used across a wide variety of platforms. So stuff like shapefiles, geodatabases, that type of thing. And GIS is used in a variety of different contexts. It's often used to explore Earth systems, which is what it was first created for, but it's also used in things like city planning and real estate or demographic analysis or anything like that. And basically GIS is important because of the ways that it helps us understand spatial relationships between things, okay? So you remember we were talking about Tobler's first law, which is, does anybody remember what Tobler's first law is? We kind of talked about it for a minute last class. Yeah, Eliza. Exactly. Yeah, everything is related to everything else, but things that are nearer to each other are more related than things that are not. It's not totally true, but that is the thing that kind of GIS runs on, and that's the assumption that how GIS works is that that is true, and so that's one of the fundamentals of GIS, and it was actually developed before GIS, so it's kind of what it was literally built on. Okay, now, as far as collecting spatial data, we've got primary source data. So if you're like a historian or anything like that, or you know anything about history, this works similarly to historical documents. And so these are data that are directly measured and captured either by doing things like ground surveying, which is on the left, or remote sensing, which we'll talk about today, and photogrammetry. But then we've also got secondary sources of data that we can get. And so these are data that are either reused from earlier studies or they're data that are obtained from elsewhere, right? So for example, a phone book is an example of secondary source data, right? Where you input that into a GIS and then it becomes spatialized and everything. Or if we're looking at this map of Bloomington, this is a map that was digitized and kind of turned into a GIS showing where areas that Bloomington was going to annex in the late 90s and early 2000s. So does that make sense to everyone, GIS? Does anybody have any questions about GIS or anything that maybe wasn't clear after last week? Okay, well, it looks like nobody has any questions about that, so then we can kind of keep moving on. And so now we get to remote sensing. Remote sensing is used for a huge variety of things, but typically it tends to be used for environmental issues. So on this remote sensing satellite image, what it's doing is it's measuring the size of hurricanes. And so this is Hurricane Irma, which is in 2017. And what remote sensing was doing here was basically showing how big is this, how much damage is it going to do, how far is it going to go, what's the speed that it's moving at. Why is it essential that we kind of know that information for maybe a natural disaster like this? Are you? No. Don't be shy. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It helps with things like evacuation and like figuring out who needs to evacuate and who doesn't. So I don't know if any of you have ever been maybe in the southeastern US during a hurricane season. I know you have, Joe. But you essentially, that's how they figure out who needs to evacuate, is using remote sensing along with a variety of other tools. So that way they know which areas are going to get hit probably. Another thing about this is it really helps measure what the impacts are of this disaster, okay, and how much damage it did, how far it went in, maybe what kind of environmental damage it did, as long as damage to people and infrastructure, these types of things. But remote sensing is not only satellite imagery. Remote sensing actually is able to display a lot of different types of data and environmental variables. So for example, we can look at it in terms of rainfall. Remote sensing often is kind of used to measure rainfall. We can talk about that if you have questions about it. after class, but essentially what it does is it helps figure out which areas are having a drought and which areas are not having a drought. I probably should have even replaced this image with one of the entire United States showing the divide between the eastern and the western US in terms of droughts and everything. But, you know, remote sensing is really useful in this way as well, because it helps us figure out a historical record of rainfall, which then allows us to determine, is this a lot of rainfall? Is this not enough rainfall? You know, what a drought is dependent on what are the normal patterns in an area. And so maybe something that's a drought in one area isn't a drought in another, but we can't know that until we have that data initially. And so that's where remote sensing kind of comes in. So remote sensing can also be used for different types of historical research. Does anybody have an idea of what this is? And don't just say a ship. It is a ship that's underwater, but more specific than that. Oh, yeah, Maddie, sorry, I didn't see your hand. Yeah, that's the front half of the Titanic. So the Titanic was found using remote sensing. Nobody knew where it was from 1912 until about the early 90s. And the way that they found it was by using remote sensing. So what this does is it basically figures out where the ocean floor is, and then it kind of takes imagery of that using LiDAR and everything, which we'll talk about. But in doing so, what we were able to figure out was where it sank, but also more specificities about why it sank in the area it did, what the measurements are, these types of things, right? So this is another part of it, of the Titanic. This is also used for things like migration and animal migration. And so remote sensing was used by the National Weather Service and radar as well, to figure out where these massive amounts of dragonflies were coming through Indiana. I don't know. Do any of you remember this? There was like a point in 2019 around this time where there were just like crowds and crowds of dragonflies everywhere. A lot of you probably weren't here at that time, I guess, but it was wild. Do you remember that? They were so gross. They were just like everywhere. Couldn't bike anywhere without getting hit by a swarm of them. But remote sensing is what like kind of allowed us to figure out what those migration patterns were at that time. But what is remote sensing exactly? Based on the readings, does anybody have just a rough definition of what remote sensing is that you can give me? Doesn't have to be perfect or complete, just like something rough. I know at least one of you did oh, Matthew. Okay, thank you. Sure. Yeah, so that's part of it for sure. It's about capturing some sort of physical data or physical occurrence in the world. Radar is one type of remote sensing that's pretty common and probably one of the older types. Satellite imagery, aerial photography. Basically what it means, well, this is a type of primary data retrieval, but essentially what it's doing is it's collecting information about the Earth without actually taking any physical measurements. So ground surveying, while it is on the Earth, you're not physically measuring that, right? You're using this instrument to measure it, or satellites, for example. And so essentially what this is it's a way, this is why it's called remote sensing, right? Because it's not on the Earth's surface, or it's not direct in this way, even if the measurements themselves are primary and are accurate. And so, you know, a lot of times what you're doing is you're obtaining this data from a distance. So radar is one, satellites, airplanes, drones. You know, if you take a picture with your cell phone from the top of I don't know, the Eiffel Tower, for example, that is also a form of remote sensing. It's a very crude way of doing it, but it counts since it is imagery from above. And that was what people did before they had all these instruments where you could fly and everything else. Basically what they're doing is the camera is capturing the physical characteristics of an area that are then allowing us to kind of sense things about it, about the Earth and everything. So does that kind of make sense to everybody as far as how remote sensing works? The one you're probably most familiar with is satellites, but there's a lot of different ways of doing it as well. And remote sensing is very common. It's just as big as GIS, but it's not the same as GIS. They're very deeply related with each other, but they have distinctions, you know? So for remote sensing, we have these things that are called platforms. And what a platform is essentially an object or a vehicle or anything else that has a camera mounted on it, where we can take pictures of the Earth from above. So there's a lot of different platforms. The most common one, like I said before, is satellites. But you know, in this diagram, we could see things like UAV drones do it, helicopters do it, you know, airplanes do it, and sometimes even at different elevations. The space shuttle does it. People even take this imagery from the International Space Station. So in a way, we could even consider that a platform. And then we've got a specific type of data that comes from remote sensing. So what was the data that we talked about last week in regard to GIS? What type of data do we typically work with? Don't overthink it. Yeah, Carter. No, pixels are for rasters, but you're getting closer. What are those three building blocks of GIS that we talked about? Yeah. Yeah, points, lines, and polygons. Carter, you're way ahead of us, though. This is exactly what we're about to get into. Yeah. So yeah, points, lines, and polygons are the fundamentals of GIS, right? Remote sensing does not collect those or use those. Remote sensing instead uses a thing it's called rasters. Rasters are the primary form of data that's collected by remote sensing, and rasters are essentially, you know, they're defined as a matrix of cells or pixels that are organized into rows and columns where each cell contains a value representing information, such as temperature or anything else. This is an example right here, this diagram of a raster. And each of these different cells or pixels is what they're called, has its own information associated with it, its own value associated with it. That's pretty typical on pictures. You know, and rasters kind of come in a variety of forms. So sometimes they're photographs that are taken aerially. Sometimes it's satellite imagery. Sometimes it's digital pictures. And sometimes it's like things like scanned maps. But the thing to really just remember about this is that a raster is not points, lines, and polygons. A raster is these cells that all have their own values to them. So if we want to, you know, maybe see a comparison of these and how they work, this is all the same data, but it's being formatted in different data types. So on the left-hand side, we've got our vectors, so points, lines, and polygons. That's pretty familiar to you all, and you all will be working with that and should have been working on it on the lab for this week. But then on the same one, we've got the same exact data with rasters. And you can see how different they look, right? There's no cells here. Everything is a lot smoother. Everything is a lot more scalable as well. It doesn't get blurry as you zoom in to a vector. Whereas with the rasters, they're a lot more, I would say, organized. They're a lot more contained, given that each cell has its own particular value, and that does not work in the same way with vectors. And so in the middle one, showing line features, for example, all of the yellow we can presume is land, and then all of the blue, each of those blue cells indicates water. And so that's basically how vectors and rasters work and how they're distinct from each other. And so whenever we're talking about remote sensing or satellite imagery or anything along those lines, we are generally talking about rasters. And while rasters can be used in GIS and often are, vectors cannot be used in remote sensing. They can be used in conjunction with each other, and they often are, and people do that a lot because they need to, but they're not the same thing. So that's kind of the main distinction between the type of data that's being collected in remote sensing versus in GIS. Does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody, or raster still kind of confusing or anything? I'm happy to expand upon it if you're still kind of unclear about what the distinction is. Okay. So now the history of remote sensing. As you all know, I'm very interested in talking about the history of these types of things and not just talking about them themselves. So remote sensing is a fairly new thing. People have often and for a long time had an interest in looking at the landscape and the earth from above, but it's only recently that we were able to do it. So if you think about these old maps that we were looking at or old paintings of cities that are kind of using a top-down perspective, those were all from imagination. The thing is like they could only go so high up, like you could maybe go to the top of a building, but a lot of that you had to kind of figure it out. And so for a very long time, there was a drive to actually be able to see the Earth from above. And prior to the advent of remote sensing, you could only get it from paintings or standing on top of tall buildings, which there weren't very many of at that time that were tall enough to actually do this type of thing. But those really were not typically feasible. And so that is where we kind of moved to remote sensing as is now, which started in roughly the late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s, around the time that cameras were first emerging. So the earliest examples of remote sensing that we know of are people strapping cameras to the chests of pigeons. I mean, look at these little pigeons. It's kind of hilarious and also kind of cute, to see them. And you'll see these pigeons more throughout the semester because I'm just like really fascinated with them and everything. But what they were doing was they were flying above the earth and then the camera was taking pictures. So these were really some of the first times that people were actually able to see the earth from above in a way that wasn't just being imagined by someone else, And I think it's just particularly interesting thinking about the creativity that had to go into this, right? Where people were driven so deeply to want to get that information and see it that they had the idea, well, there's these little devices that we have now, cameras. Why don't we strap them to these pigeons that we've domesticated for like thousands of years to follow directions and everything? It's pretty ingenious, And they were really, really trained pretty well. But this was hugely influential because it was the first time people actually saw the Earth from above, from a perspective that was not human or not predicated on our own bodies and everything. From there, we get to and these kind of were happening simultaneously, the pigeons as well as the hot air balloons, I should say. So they weren't separate from each other necessarily. But the first human-controlled remote sensing, where you didn't just have to strap it onto something and where you could actually choose the pictures you were taking, can be traced to around 1860. So at that time, hot air balloons had just recently been created, which allowed people to go higher in the air themselves than they ever had been before. Soon after that, people started bringing cameras up with them. And the earliest known example of remote sensing where a human is actually actively taking those pictures was in 1860 in Boston, actually in this image on the right-hand side right here. And what they were doing there was they were taking aerial photographs of the city. And so this is the first known aerial photograph of a city anywhere in the world. Aerial photograph taken by a human at least. And these hot air balloons go a lot higher up in the air than pigeons did, so they could also see a lot more than had been possible before. Soon after aerial photography kind of started to become more common, it already started to be used for disaster relief. So people saw this immediately. So if you're looking at this image above right here, this was taken with a camera from a kite by this guy named George Lawrence, and it was following the earthquake of 1906 in San Francisco, which was one of the biggest earthquakes in US history, and it like destroyed at least half of the city, but maybe even more. And so what you can see right here is that when we're looking at this, right, we can actually see the areas where the damage was the most heavy, right? So if we're looking around here, you can see kind of most of the buildings have been leveled in this area, they're very flat, whereas we still see some standing right here. And so, what remote sensing was really doing was it was allowing us not just literally a new view of the world, but it was allowing us a new way of interpreting and understanding the world and actually being able to collect data about these types of things that wouldn't have been possible even 50 years before. World War I, like I don't know if you all remember, I said this last week, a lot of these technologies were developed from war. GIS, remote sensing, a lot of it came from the military and was funded by the military initially. So aerial photography really, really began to rapidly advance during the First World War. At the beginning of the First World War, airplanes were still a really new invention. And so prior to them even being used for things like bombing or, maybe like fighting kind of in the air where they had like guns strapped to them, the first thing they had strapped to them were cameras, and they were initially used for reconnaissance before people realized that, oh, okay, wait, we could probably use these for these other more destructive purposes. And so initially how people would do it was those planes at that time had 2 seats, and the person in the back seat would have a camera and they would be taking all of the imagery. But over time, by the end of the war, they had started actually building the cameras into the plane. And so that way it just needed one person, and that person could just take a picture really quickly, kind of from the nose of the plane. Then, kind of continued to develop over time. Airplanes and photography started to get better and better. But in the Second World War is really when it started to change as well and became more modern in the way that we know it now. And so it was at this time that infrared was first created, which is a really important part of remote sensing. And so what that did was it allowed specific features to be shown. So you could actually see, for example, a lot more clearly all these bomb craters and everything and kind of figure this out. But you could also see a lot more clearly where maybe enemy encampments were or anything else. And then over time, after following the Second World War, this kind of started to disseminate more further outside of the military into more civilian type purposes. A new feature of remote sensing that also appeared was the use of rockets that were equipped with cameras that could transmit their imagery wirelessly. Do not ask me how that worked prior to like digital data. I have absolutely no idea how they did it. It's pretty amazing though that they were even able to do it in the first place. The rockets themselves did not work very well. They were usually intended to bomb a particular area. And so right here, this is what's called the V2 rockets, which V stands for vengeance. And these were designed by Nazi Germany as a way to attack Great Britain because they had a lot of trouble kind of getting to Great Britain for a while there. And so they kind of started designing these as a way to attack Great Britain without sending bombers and other airplanes over there, right? It was kind of a way of remotely attacking it. These were definitely used. They were never successful. As far as I know, Joseph, you might know, as far as I'm aware, V2 rockets never actually even hit anywhere in Britain. Yeah, no, it wasn't very accurate at all. But these, even though they didn't work, they did kind of lay the groundwork for future remote sensing. Then we've got radar, which Matthew brought up as well. So radar is a very early warning system, and kind of the way that it works is it would use sound, and it would kind of figure out if there were people within a specific radius. I'm sure that you've all seen movies or TV or anything else that has radar on it, where you've got the little dots on the screen. This is also something that is used in remote sensing. It's maybe not as common today as it used to be, but it is a thing that people would do, and it's really become particularly important for figuring out migration patterns of animals, so like butterflies or birds or anything else like that. Then we get to the Cold War. And so during the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union were in a constant battle to one-up each other technologically. So in 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first satellite in space, which is Sputnik 1. And Sputnik 1 was just a really, really simple satellite that all it did was take images from space. And then a few months later, they also launched the first living creature into space, which was this dog right here named Laika. These events, the events of the Cold War were kind of or this was kind of followed up on by the US, where then the US advanced more than the Soviet Union did, and they were kind of constantly battling in that way, right? So the Cold War wasn't just cold in the sense that it was the US and the Soviet Union funding external militaries or other areas kind of to either combat or promote communism. It was also a Cold War in the sense that there was literally a war over technology and who could have the best technologies. And so that was how remote sensing kind of came to be as we know it. Now I've got this video that we could watch real quick about Leica and everything. Let's see if I can get that up. Okay.
После стратосферы совсем неплохо. I'm commander of Sputnik 2. Growing up on the streets of Moscow, I could only look to the heavens and wonder. To be the first in space is an accomplishment I never dreamed about. I do this in the name of the motherland, in the name of Comrade Lenin, Comrade Khrushchev, in the name of the party, and in the name of sausage. I am Leica. This isn't a happy story, but it's my story. And there's little time to tell it. From 3 dogs, Albina, Mushka, myself, I was selected for this mission. What set me apart? My ability to withstand the centrifuge tests. My superior aptitude to sit and eat and go to the bathroom in a small cabin and even smaller spacesuit. Also, Albina just had a litter of puppies. But the mission was rushed. After the glorious launch of Sputnik 1, Comrade Khrushchev wanted another success to commemorate the 40th anniversary of our triumphant Bolshevik Revolution. But that gave us only a month. The temperature control system was hastily designed, and there was no time for a recovery plan to bring me home. When Sputnik 1 launched, its signal was heard around the world. On Sputnik 2, the signal of my heartbeat is only heard by Soviet scientists. During the launch, the telemetric sensors said my heart rate was 3 times as fast. The G-forces caused my respiratory rate to increase 5-fold. Then, my heart slowed. In zero gravity, in space, my breathing is slower and deeper. I am alive. While I orbit the Earth, information of respiration, blood pressure, heart rate, even my movements in the weightless cabin are constantly transmitted back. So, I am alone, but I am not alone. My comrades can hear me. And I orbit. But this is a one-way mission. By the second orbit, it's getting so hot. There was clearly a miscalculation in thermodynamics. The cooling fans are useless. I know my comrades tried. I know they are there. I orbit for a 3rd time. Through the small window, I can see Earth. I'm not sure where the motherland is. I am a dog, after all. It's my 4th orbit. Maybe 5 hours since I entered space. It's so hot. I feel like I can't breathe. The telemetric sensors have failed. I look at Earth out the window.
So that's pretty messed up. and pretty sad, of course. But and the Soviet Union did end up later on kind of saying like that scientist said that we probably should not have done that and thought about it better. But this was a major advancement in remote sensing and remote sensing imagery, right? Where we were still just learning about how to send satellites up in the air and everything else and kind of see the world from a view that had never been seen before, before Leica at least. And during the Cold War, remote sensing really began to be used for spying. Spying and surveillance were really major components of it. So we've got this thing called Project Corona. So Project Corona was a project run by the CIA from the early 60s to the early 70s. They had about 145 missions, and what they did during it was they took 860,000 photographs, which is amazing. And at this time, the way that they would get those photographs down was they would have these canisters that would come off of it and parachute somewhere into the ocean to kind of be picked up physically. And what they were doing was they were using it to surveil the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, and other communist countries, and kind of trying to see what they were doing. It consisted of about 8 satellites, and so those satellites, what they were doing, which they kind of overlapped with each other to get as much information as they could, was they were using basically photographic methods to get as much data about what the Soviet Union was doing as possible. And actually, a lot of this imagery is still used today in research. Researchers use this. So all those images, those 860,000, are, I think, publicly available at this point, and they're not that hard to access. And so there's even a legacy to the spying that kind of still continues today in that way. Resolution kind of during this time and driven by spying became really high. So if you remember last week, we talked about how a lot of this stuff can be either very fine resolution, which means you can see very closely, or it's very coarse. And so for a long time, the imagery you would get from these photographs was very coarse. Okay, you couldn't really see that much. But over the course of the Cold War, it went from being pretty coarse to the point of you could see individual cars, you could see individual people. You might not be able to see the faces, you might not be able to see the make or the model, but you could roughly tell what kind of car it was. You could roughly tell how many people were in an area. In some ways, it's actually kind of terrifying to think about that. And today it's even more so, where you actually can see those things. Before I was at IU, I worked a job for a satellite imagery company that was, I mentioned before, contracted to the Department of Defense. That's not as a brag, it's actually more of a regret, if anything. But one of the things I saw there was that you could actually get satellite imagery today that is inches, to the point that you could read a license plate and figure it out just with that imagery, right? So the US now has this imagery pretty much everywhere, you know, and a lot of that imagery we were actually getting of North Korea that we were looking at as well. So we could even see, you know, maybe not exactly the faces, but you could kind of roughly tell what position someone was in, whether they were in the military or anything else, right? And so this is a kind of a legacy of the Cold War within remote sensing. And then another major project was called Gambit. And so Gambit is probably the most well-known one, and it lasted for about 20 years from 1963 to 1984. And the reason it's called Gambit is because that's the name of the satellite. So there was the KH-7 Gambit, which went for about 4 years from 63 to 67. And then there was the KH-8 Gambit, which went from 66 to 84. That second Gambit was probably one of the longest lasting satellites ever, and it was definitely the most precise satellite. And it had resolution that was closer to like 4 inches, which doesn't mean 4 inches from the ground, but it means like you could just see very finely what's happening and everything. This right here is an image from Gambit, I believe, or from the KH Gambit 8, showing the Kremlin in Moscow. So you could see that's like very fine detail right there. You know, you could see all the individual buildings and everything. And today it's kind of gone even further than that. So now we'll get in, that's kind of the gist of remote sensing and remote sensing's history. We'll kind of talk about some applications next class. But now I kind of wanted to discuss this Howley et al. Article. I think I'm going to have you do this as groups, your tables. And so if you could go through and answer these questions, and then we'll kind of come back and we'll discuss it as a bigger group. So I'll give you about like maybe what, 10 minutes-ish? I'll give you about like 10 minutes to kind of go over these questions and discuss the article along with your tables. So, you know, kind of you can get going ahead with that. I hope you all read the article, and then we'll kind of come back here in a few minutes and discuss it as a group. Recording. Okay, so what was the big question that Howley et al. Were asking in this article? Or like maybe you have a different, maybe you have found a few different questions that they were asking. But kind of what were they trying to get at with this? What did they want to know? You can just give it to me roughly. I know this is it's a difficult article. But yeah, roughly, what did they want to know in this article? What was their goal? Yeah, Matthew. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. It's the article is written in a way that is difficult because it's more of a scientific article and they use like a lot of jargon and everything. But the question they have is fairly simple. They want to identify permanent structures and especially food storage, which is what they call pit caches or cache pits in forested areas within northern Michigan. And so that was kind of what they were trying to do with this. And as a way to do that, they wanted to use LiDAR. Can anybody describe to me just super roughly how LiDAR works? They do talk about it in the article a bit. Yeah, Carter. Exactly. So what they're doing, so that's a really good description of it. So essentially what they're doing is they are, you know, they fly a plane over, or you can do this kind of with satellite imagery, but typically they tend to do it with planes or drones and everything. And what you're doing is you're shooting millions and millions and millions a second pieces of light to the ground. And then what they're doing, and actually pieces of light, they're using lasers. So LiDAR is really cool because it's this use of lasers where they're shooting millions and millions of lasers into the ground. And then what happens is those lasers bounce back up to the plane and the plane catches them. And then from there, what happens is they calculate how much time it took for the laser to hit the ground and then come back. And this is like in like millionths of a second, you know, it's really, really precise. And then once they have that amount of time, they can measure the distance from where the plane was to the ground. And then that's how they can calculate elevation. So they can tell that something has high elevation if it was a lot shorter for that laser to come back, low elevation if it was a lot longer for that laser to come back. Does that kind of make sense as far as how LiDAR works? I guess if you want to think about LiDAR, think about lasers and think about elevation. LiDAR is a very, very cool tool. And how were they using LiDAR in this article? What did they do to kind of resolve that question that they were asking? So Matthew was kind of hinting at it in his answer about what the goal of the question was, or the goal of the article was. But maybe someone who hasn't spoken today. How were they using LiDAR to answer their question? And why would they choose LiDAR over something else? Like, what's the benefit of LiDAR in this situation? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So the thing that's awesome about LiDAR and the lasers that LiDAR is using is it penetrates forest cover. And so that way, things that you might not be able to see otherwise, you are able to see, and you're kind of able to see through that thick forest cover. And that's especially important in northern Michigan with how many forests there are there and everything. And what they could do is, well, they can identify things that they wouldn't be able to identify otherwise. So what are the things that LiDAR in this case revealed that the researchers would not have been able to find without it? Yeah, Eliza. Yeah, so they found clustering patterns that they didn't know existed before, and they wouldn't have been able to figure out without it, for sure. So that's one thing that they wouldn't have found without LiDAR. What's another thing that they wouldn't have found about without LiDAR? Or what's another conclusion they drew? Yeah. Yeah, so wait, say that one more time, I'm sorry. Yeah, so that's one other thing, right? They identified cache pits they wouldn't have been able to find otherwise because they were hidden to the human eye. Then there's a third thing that they were able to do. Does anybody know what that was that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise? It's actually a lot more simple than you would think, so don't overthink it. Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. The complexity and the complicated stuff, right, with hunter-gatherer societies, for sure. So that's part of it. I mean, what I was thinking, I actually wasn't thinking that, but that's also true. Um, they found cache pits in areas that were a lot further inland than they would have otherwise. So before they did this, the assumption was that all of those pits tended to be pretty close to the Great Lakes or within a pretty close distance. So there was this assumption that these societies that they were studying, these prehistoric societies, were, they were kind of centered around the lakes. And so that was kind of what they were doing. What this showed was that actually they weren't centered in those areas and that they were going around a lot further than anticipated, and they were going a lot deeper into the forests than it had been anticipated before that. Did you all like this article? How many of you, was this like your first time reading like an academic, more like scientific, scholarly article? Not, I mean, you don't have to say whether you liked it or not. I'm just curious if this is like, have you all been exposed to this type of writing and everything prior to this? So some of you were shaking your heads, yes. What difficulties did you have in kind of working through this article and reading it? Don't be shy, I have difficulties reading articles all the time. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, totally. Academic articles, thank you, Rourke. Academic articles like this they can be dense. They use a lot of jargon. What else did you find difficult when you were going through this? So it was easy. Other than that, it was easy for everyone. Eliza. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great tip. And you're actually kind of going a little ahead of what I was about to ask, which is, does anybody have tips about how to read these types of articles? Because it is a skill to learn how to read this, right? And here's the thing, here's the dirty secret about academic articles. Nobody reads the entire academic article word for word. Joe, do you ever read the entirety of an academic article for every single word? Exactly. Yeah, so a lot of times what you can do with these types of articles is you can read the intro and then you can read the conclusion and then you can kind of skim the rest. And usually for this specific type of article, I should say, scientific, humanities papers work differently than scientific articles, although they have a similar type thing where a lot of times what you can do is you can read the first and the last sentence of each paragraph, and then you can figure out whether you find it important or not for that. Does anyone have any other tips about how to read this or any strategies that you use?
picking or method? Because I feel like a lot of studies use that so that other scientists can repeat their studies. So
Yeah.
it goes more in depth.
Yeah, totally. So a lot of the data and method stuff, that tends to be for other scientists. So, you know, you think about when you're making a map, right? The first thing you want to think about is audience. It works exactly the same for an academic article. This article was written for archaeologists and people that know LiDAR. They probably did not intend it to be taught in this level of a class, although I think it's a useful teaching tool to discuss. Another tip or suggestion that I have for this, and you won't have that many of these types of articles in this course, but there will be a few that are similar later on. So I just want you to keep this in mind, is look for keywords. Every article has some sort of keywords that they use more than the rest. And the more they use a word, probably the more important it is to what they're saying or what they're arguing or anything like that. Okay, so now we can get to this other group activity. I will post this on Canvas real quick because I forgot to do that before class, is I want you to go to Indiana Maps, which is it's essentially a mapping kind of software tool that's run by Indiana University and the government of Indiana, kind of in conjunction with each other. And let me pull that up real quick. And then what we're going to do is we are actually going to kind of see how Monroe County has changed over time. And so in this, you can see that, you know, you can kind of pan and zoom around the state of Indiana. We can even zoom out a little more if we want to see all these different counties. And then what we can do is on the right-hand side, there's these drop-down menus for picking different counties. So what you're going to do, and the years available for that. And so what you're going to do is you are going to select Monroe County. And then from Monroe County, what you are going to do is you are going to, give me just a sec. You are going to kind of zoom in and you're going to look at the imagery as it changes over time. So what you're going to do is you're going to go from 1939 to 1958 to 1967 to 1980. And then what I want you to talk about is what are the changes that you're seeing in Monroe County at that time? And then what is the change, or where is the change located? I'm not going to spoil that for you. So I'm going to make the computers available for you to use. And then I am going to post this on Canvas real quick. So if you could all log in with your groups while I'm doing that. And then I'll pull the questions and everything back up onto the screen once I've got that posted. And if your computer isn't working at your table, you can just use your laptops with your group. That's fine. What's today's date? Is it the 20th? Okay, so now that's up on Canvas and you should be able to access it and all the instructions. I will pull this back up now. And I'll give you about 10 minutes, or you know, I'll give you about 7 or 8 minutes to kind of go over this with your group, discuss these questions, and feel free to explore other parts of Indiana and the state of Indiana.